Once a pianist asked me after the Emperor, how do you get those pianissimo scales so beautiful? So I explained the pedaling and the harmony and maybe some fingering and weight and all that stuff. And she said, what's the trick? And I said, there's no trick. You just got to practice having good habits and keep at it, I guess.
Yeah, that's not what people like to hear, Garrick. We need secret. We need your secrets. Okay, tell us your secrets. It's my pleasure to be back on Tonebase Live. I feel like it's been a minute. I was going to introduce Garrick, but then I realized he needs no introduction. This is Garrick Ohlsson. You might recognize him from such Tonebase hits as Garrick Ohlsson Presents Rock 3, and Garrick Ohlsson teaches Chopin's G minor ballade, and of course, everyone's favorite, Garrick Ohlsson on pedaling. And so anyway, when he's not making videos for Tonebase, in his spare time, Garrick likes to tour the world playing the piano. So I'm going to have to pose a question to you, Garrick. Where in the world are you right now?
I'm in Bellingham, Washington State, sort of tending towards extreme northwest of Washington State.
Can you see the water from where you are?
We are on the water, and it is gorgeous. And from Bellingham, you can see some of the San Juan Islands, and we're not far from Vancouver Island or Vancouver, BC, for that matter.
What have you been doing today? Anything interesting?
Nah, just I took a nap. No, I had 2 rehearsals with the Bellingham Festival Orchestra with Michael Palmer conducting, and we read through all of the Beethoven piano concertos, which we're performing Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night this weekend.
Well, so this is a pretty spectacular feat to play not just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 Beethoven concertos at a time, but all 5. Most people don't do that. Most pianists don't do that. When was the last time you performed such a feat?
Actually, the answer is last week.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I did the same feat, if you will, at the Grand Teton Festival with their wonderful orchestra and Sir Donald Runnicles, the music director, conducting.
I'm really excited to jump in to some of the details of certain concerti, but I want to just spend a little bit of time talking to a man who spends his life touring the world playing the piano. First of all, I have picked up Garrick Ohlsson suitcases before. They're quite heavy, even for short trips. Talk to us a little bit about your routine.
I always overpack. And in my house in San Francisco, in the garage, we've built a trunk room for suitcases so that when I come home, I just have to take out what needs washing or replacing. And as a result, the big suitcase has, half of the stuff in it I will never use in any given trip, but it's always there in case I do. Because inevitably, if I repack for a specific trip, it takes an hour to figure it out. And I hate packing. I hate packing. So I would much rather take too much. And also, inevitably, if I repack for my short trip to, let's say, San Diego, which is for 2 days, I'll arrive in San Diego on a Saturday night and discover I've forgotten my shirt. And I'm a large item, and it's not so easy to find, when there's an afternoon recital in San Diego, it's not so absolutely easy to buzz by a store and find a shirt that fits. So I always have extra stuff. Maybe I'm a survivalist, I don't know.
So the trade-off is you never have to pack and you never have to worry about having this or that article of clothing. But on the other hand, you have to carry very heavy suitcases. So you must have good technique because you haven't injured yourself lugging these things around.
Not doing that, no. I'm 6'4" and reasonably strong. So I do not recommend this for 4'9" pianists.
I've heard you're able to lift up Beethoven's Emperor Concerto and lift it up over your head. That's how.
Yeah, I press it daily. No.
You're on the plane a lot. Do you do any practicing away from the piano when you're on planes? Do you practice in your mind?
Not much. Planes are too distracting or too boring or too annoying. But I do daydream a lot about music, and not when I'm on planes, but when I'm being driven from Seattle to Bellingham, which is about 2 hours plus with traffic. But it's not organized. I'm not much of a worker away from the piano. I can be if I am desperate, but I don't like to. I am far too addicted to the gratification of sound.
Okay, but
also the feel of feedback.
But if you're retaining this mass of scores of music, recitals next week, different concertos all the time, you can't possibly be doing all of that preparation work at the piano. Something has to be going on away from it, right?
Oh, I'm sure. But let me back up and say that all this massive work of Beethoven, well, in 1999, when I played the five concertos together for the first time, was by no means the first time I ever played a Beethoven concerto. I mean, I learned the first concerto when I was 12 or something, so, and I've played them all so many times that they're in my hard drive, basically. So I only have to just bring them up and see if there's any shaky spots. Kids or young people in conservatories ask me, how can you play Tchaikovsky one week and Mozart the next and then Chopin? It's a lot easier after 100 times. It's not that music making at a good level is ever easy, exactly. It's just that it's like climbing the difficult mountain. What the first time you do it is, can I do it? Whew, I made it to the top, and now I have to get down. Whereas, the second time you realize, oh, there's a nice thing to look at over there, and this is not a difficult part. So I can relax and enjoy that. And when you're playing with a great or even a not great conductor, your colleague has musical ideas and suggests things. And then you think about how you play that phrase or how you connect with the orchestra, how you listen to the clarinet here or neglect to if you're not doing your job right. And you absorb it as a sponge. And after a while, there are certain things you can't forget. Oh, this is too good. I played it when I was 15, the first movement of it, with my high school orchestra at White Plains High School. Now, White Plains High School is an excellent school, but the student orchestra is not, say, the Juilliard student orchestra. So we rehearsed it daily for months, and the second violins really couldn't quite manage some of it. So we doubled them with a trumpet, of course. What else are you going to do? And I think we had a trombone playing the second bassoon part because there was only one bassoon player. And I remember very well that in the opening tutti, one of the flutists got one beat behind the orchestra. And to this day, I still hear that spot played that way because I heard it about 50 times when I was 15, and it always amuses me that I remember that flutist was late there. And every time I get there, it's like, oh, how come they're playing on time? So, it's so wired into me. And everybody's different in terms of their retention, the various memories we have, the muscle memory, the analytical memory, oral memory, sight memory, and all those things. So far, happily, I haven't had a memory problem with these pieces or anything, but I know them really well. I don't think I could write out the whole orchestration, but I could certainly write out the piano part if I had the time.
You're telling me in 50 plus years of playing these things, you've never had a memory slip?
Not in these. I've had very few real ones in my life. I have had a couple. I'm not going to talk about them because they were very embarrassing.
Yeah, and I feel like, I don't know if you're superstitious, but just mentioning them to some pianists is a no-no, especially the night before.
Yes, absolutely. You don't because it's like, don't think of an elephant. All you think of is an elephant,
Yeah.
And also, when you know something really, really well like that, a memory slip may feel like you're about to have one, but if you just let your hands take over, they usually find it better than your mind can under pressure.
Do you feel like there's certain kinds of memory, whether tactile or mental, that for you are operative, or are they sort of all operating together?
I think it's a synergy, definitely. For example, I'm not strongest on visual at all. I mean, some people can, see scores in their head. I mean, not most people, but
what about seeing the keyboard? Do you sort of visualize what it not just feels like, but what it looks like spatially in front of you?
As a matter of fact, I've probably mentioned it at least in one tone-based lesson. It's very good to practice with your eyes closed, so that you develop tactile proprioception, for that difficult jump. And don't play it fearfully. Just close your eyes and miss it and discover that you don't actually know how far away the E is from that G an octave above it. And it's not that cures it forever, but when you add the acuity of the vision to that, it helps. Yo-Yo Ma once said about, in an article in the New Yorker about physical intelligence, when he has to play a passage on the cello, it goes up to a high note. Are you thinking of every note when you play it? No, you're not. You've had to practice it so many times. My example is always serving a tennis ball. You don't throw the ball up in the air and pull the racket back and then take a book out and say, what do I do next? I have to find out. No, it's something you've learned, and it's in you. And the more consciously I think of it, the more likely I'm to mess up, and which actually does happen. I mean, you sometimes have to tell yourself not to worry consciously. And it's not that I'm perfect, far from it.
I imagine there's something called like a purely musical memory, which can connect with these things, where, for example, what an A flat chord is composed of, every inversion of it that you've played a trillion times, A flat feels a certain way, this kind of thing.
That's right, especially that A flat chord at that place in that piece. The way that a word in a beautiful poem will suddenly sound very special, but even though we've known the word and how to spell it. This is a complicated one, and I don't know if it can easily be, I doubt it can easily be answered.
Yeah, I think this is part of the mystery of how musicians learn and perform is something purely musical is combining with the rest of our faculties.
Yes, I mean, this is not to get too deep into it, but for example, what Wagner called the melos of music. It's sort of like music is this huge thing, which is not the notes on the page, it's not your fingers on the keys, it's the mixture of all of it, and it sort of floats and hovers up there. I mean, sometimes I have to say to piano students, the sound isn't in your hand, it's not in the keyboard, it's what happens. I mean, to make a most elemental example, sometimes if I have, especially say in a master class, and I'm trying to make that point to somebody, I'll say, here, okay, play a note kind of loud with pedal and stick your foot down. Now have a conversation with me. And then if it's a bass note, you hear it, a few seconds later, it's still sounding. I said, you're still playing. It's the sound is something that is out there beyond us, not to get too far into the mystical vision, but and music is like that too. Every piece of music is also like a journey, if you will. And once you've taken that journey a lot of times, you do a lot of it, you know how to go to the store in your car. You don't actually have to think of turning right on Birch Street and then left on Violet or whatever, you just kind of do it. And it's almost the same way I've noticed with knowing these great concertos. It wasn't that way when I was first starting out. And most people don't get the privilege of playing them as much as I have too, so that they can't relax into it as much. But you just kind of know what's coming here, oh, this crescendo, it's going to feel great. I'm going to go, in the middle of the first movement of the fifth concerto, there's this one wonderful spot, dum, bum, 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 with the left hand going, bum, 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 bum. That crescendo is so exciting. It's like, wow. Despite the fact that it's one of the most difficult things.
I was going to say, you're talking about this like, oh, what a wonderful musical moment coming up. And everybody else is just tearing their hair out because it's the hardest spot in the piece.
It is the hardest spot in the piece. But here I have to quote one of my great masters, Claudio Arrau, with whom I had the privilege of having a bunch of lessons back in the 70s. This was a different piece, but it's the same principle. It was a spot in the Brahms second, which is virtually impossible. When I said, but I'm always so terrified when I get here, he looked at me, he said, but of course you are. And he said, but you must work at it and become the master of it so much that when the performance comes, you look forward to playing it and how beautiful it will be and how people will be able to enjoy it. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty high bar, But I remember, as a matter of fact, that very spot, I remember the first time I heard Arrau played, it was the Emperor, and I was sitting kind of close, and I knew that was a scary spot. I was about 16. And, I was just watching him, and like, he didn't look scared at all. I mean, it was very intense. Wow, it's like, gee, I'd like to be able to do that someday. And sometimes I can.
Since we're on the subject, just quick technical tip for the pianist out there. What do you stay close to the key? How do you play those thirds? Yeah.
Beautifully, my dear, beautifully. Pretty close to the key. Make sure, okay, now we're getting geeky. That's why we're here. Bum, 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 bum. That's easy. Not so easy, right? Mm. Thirds. Well, first of all, you got to find a fingering that works for your hand really well. I mean, for me, the first one is 1-5 on the C and E flat. Okay, then 4, then the rest normal. Make sure the lower voice sings out. Because if you try to play it with two hands and you don't even play the upper voice, dum, diddle, bum, bum, dum, diddle, when it goes into the third, it'll almost sound the same. So make sure, people are always so concentrated on the melody, dum, diddle, dum, bum, bum, dum, diddle, dum, bum, bum. If that bottom of that third isn't strong, it won't sound snappy and solid. So make sure, then another thing to do is make sure the first one is really well placed, dum, ba. Make sure you know where you are in the world, not, don't have your hand somewhere up here before you attack it, or be so close to the keys that it sounds like you're, I made it, oh good, dum diddle dum bum bum. So you have to get the first one right. You got to get them all right, but make sure that the third one to the eighth note, dum da da ba-dum, make sure dum biddle da dum bum ba, that the bum bum bum, the first eighth note of that is crispy. So even if you're not playing it as magnificently as Mr. Arrau might have many years ago, you'll still hear dum diddle da bum. You'll get the music of it. Once again, the music is larger even than the technical difficulty.
Now that you've told me all this, I can tell. Now I'm going to immediately be able to go play it right now perfectly.
Of course.
Just from that knowledge.
Once a pianist asked me after the Emperor about some difficult passage in it, and she said to me, how do you get those pianissimo scales so beautiful? So I explained the pedaling and the harmony and maybe some fingering and weight and all that stuff. And she said, what's the trick? And I said, there's no trick. You can do all the best ideas that all the best teachers in the world have, and you're still not going to get it 100% of the time. But it's not a trick. You just got to practice having good habits and keep at it, I guess.
Yeah, that's not what people like to hear, Garrick. We need secret. We need your secrets. Okay, tell us your secrets.
Oh, if only I knew. Believe me, I would tell all my students immediately, because you've noticed I don't withhold information.
No, you're an open book.
I think many artists have felt privately, we don't talk about this in public, that we're actually frauds. Gosh, they actually want me to do this, but it's really not very good, and I'm not saying that to be stupid either. Just I really try to make sure that I do as well as I can, so that I don't. I know that sounds disingenuous, but I've had enough affirmation by the world that I guess it's okay.
Well, I think your modesty is probably what helped you learn 100,000 pieces of music in your lifetime.
Yeah, and that's also a fact that everybody's got a different character. Some people can, some people can't. Some great artists have very small repertoires. Some great artists have enormous repertoires. Some not so great artists have both extremes. It's just we're all different that way. We have different levels of talent, training, environment, teachers, desires, aspects.
Or the performance repertoire is small. Like Horowitz is relatively small compared to what he could actually play, apparently. I mean, he recorded the Emperor. I imagine he allegedly knew all the 32 sonatas and probably knew all the concertos on some.
That's what he actually said to me when I met him. And then he said, with his usual coy pride, he said, I know every note, 110, but I don't play it in public. It's very important, he said, to choose the pieces that are very well suited to you in public.
So a couple of years ago was Beethoven's 250th. I'm going to ask you a question. Please don't get mad. Please don't get mad. Do you remember the 200th Beethoven year? And did you perform any concertos for that?
Well, in the 200th anniversary of Beethoven's birth was 1970, which was the year I won the Chopin competition in Warsaw.
So you were playing other things?
I didn't have a career, or not hardly much of one at all. And I was otherwise engaged. So I don't remember playing any Beethoven concertos that year. And I can't actually tell you now if I played any Beethoven in recital. But everybody else certainly did.
Well, that brings up an interesting question, because you're an esteemed Chopinist, if this is actually a word. I hear people use it. And yet you're playing Beethoven. That's not every Chopin player. There's your Chopin players who they'll play their Beethoven out of duty. Or whatever. They'll teach the sonatas, but they're not going to record them, probably, or maybe one or two.
And vice versa. We do know there in the legendary past, there are a number of great artists who played Chopin and Beethoven most beautifully and in a way that was persuasively authentic. I mean, Beethoven sounded like Beethoven and Chopin sounded like Chopin. There was a complaint earlier, before World War II, that the Chopin specialists made everything sound like Chopin, kind of whatever. But I think it once again has to do with your temperament. I mean, if you're lucky enough to be an artist who's managed to have a career where people are actually listening to you and paying attention, you could say how much stylistic versatility you have, or how much of a chameleon are you?
Which is it for you?
Maybe it's both. Both.
Because I do think it's those people who have very strict, particular temperaments who probably narrow themselves as specialists. You are the opposite. I mean, you really have this broad repertoire, and I think it does match your personality of just being open-minded, curious.
Well, thank you. Yes, I recognize myself in what you say. As much as I love the legendary Vladimir Horowitz and would go to hear any note he played anytime, the ones who were really my truer heroes were people who were more, I would say, more versatile. and specifically two, one with whom I had the privilege of a few studies, Arrau, and Sviatoslav Richter, who I heard, who made an enormous impression on me in the 60s, perhaps even greater than the return of Horowitz. I know that's sacrilege, but there I was. I mean, Richter gave 5 recitals that same spring, and it was like, then I heard Horowitz, and like, that was incredible, but what we heard was just as incredible. One of the things about Richter particularly, and Arrau, I would say in their primes, was that when they played Debussy, it sounded like Debussy. It didn't sound like somebody trying to get themselves into the idiom. I've never enjoyed the narrow focus very much in that way, interpretively or stylistically. But also when I say chameleon, you know, the great Arrau, when he taught, he would never demonstrate, because he said talented people imitate too easily and they don't know what they've imitated, which is true. And also he would then say a little more philosophically, it's bad enough that the students I have hear my recordings in concerts, and they all want to do, you know, to make him happy. That's, you want to make the teacher happy. And if your teacher's a great master, you want to be like him, and you even, many students even absorb the mannerisms of their teacher. On the other hand, I think if you don't have some of that ability, you're also missing something. Once again, back to the legendary Horowitz. When I was 15, I was trying to imitate him a lot because it was the most exciting thing on the planet. I thought, if I could just try hard. And I discovered that it's not just by trying harder. You have to have a lot, there's a lot of science involved in it too. No, you shouldn't just put on a record of Richter playing a piece that you think he plays well and then just do like, or there's another viewpoint. Now I'm going on too much about this. Put that Richter record on. Try to see if you can do that you admire so much.
I think there's a lot of value. I mean, look, when Bach learned how to compose, he didn't just like wait for God to tell him how counterpoint worked. He copied other people's music, literally copied it.
Literally.
So I don't know why we don't do that more as pianists. Actually try to sound like Horowitz right now. In all modesty, just do it.
That's a thought. And as Rosina Levine said in a different context, good luck, it won't be so easy for you.
So you've mentioned you got to play for Horowitz, you studied a little bit with Arrau, but conductors now, and specifically Beethoven Concertos. Any memories with certain conductors that was absolutely thrilling and has stayed with you forever with any of these 5 great pieces over the years?
Quite a few. 2 people who aren't the most famous, but the great pedagogue, teacher, and great conductor, Otto Werner Müller, well known in the conducting field as a very demanding master, very exacting. He taught me the Beethoven Emperor the way a conductor has to know it, and deeper, much deeper. In other words, even down to, you have to listen for the second horn here because it's a very difficult interval, and so on. And when I was 20, the second horn was, is there more than one? I didn't know anything. And he sort of showed me how the piece was made in the very deep sense. And it's stayed with me for the rest of my life, because no matter which conductor I play with, when you really know how the house is built, you can actually then recreate it in slightly different ways because you have the freedom, rather than if you just, this is the way I play that passage. My life-changing experience of the 4th concerto was with Julius Hedgie, who was the music director of the Albany Symphony for many, many years. I never had felt until that point such a musical conversation with the conductor while it was happening, and this was not planned. We just had the normal conductor solo. How do you do this? What's your tempo? And I thought, God, he hears everything I do, not just following. I mean, he's making the music with me in the most sympathetic way. And I was about 26, 7 at that point, and I guess maybe the piece began to mean even more to me at that point. And I mean, all he said in our discussion at the beginning, I remember he says, I take the moderato and the allegro very seriously. And I thought, sure, whatever, you know. Then I heard what he was doing, and it was so beautiful. Another lesson of a very famous conductor. I played the 3rd several times with Seiji Ozawa, and I played it with him in London with the Philharmonia Orchestra. And I remember, in the way that a conductor can, he spent about 15 minutes of the first rehearsal on the first maybe 24 bars. lengths of notes, balances, dynamics, understanding, context, this and that, and this and that, and this and that, and this. And then he kind of didn't do much more. And I knew him enough well, and we were close enough in age, even though he was so famous. I said, Seiji, that was great. I said, but you didn't do much in the rest of the rehearsal. And he basically said, I'm establishing the basic principles. It's a great orchestra. They'll get the idea of, he says, and if not, we'll work on it. And I thought, and I've told many conductors about that, and they say, yeah, that's how it works. You established the principles on which we're working.
The irony of being a great conductor with a great orchestra is actually you don't have to be as good of a conductor with those players. It's the greatest conductors might be the ones with playing, conducting the second tier and third tier symphonies and making them sound like gold.
Exactly. I mean, my view is that a conductor's job is to make any orchestra sound better, even the Berlin Philharmonic. Good luck. Not so easy for anybody.
I wanted to ask, because you played all the sonatas, if you could compare them to the concerti, where are the similarities, where are the differences between?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, Beethoven was a virtuoso pianist of his era and ahead of everybody else at the time. It's sometimes brutally difficult piano playing. I mean, you've really got to practice. The late and great Joseph Karlekstein, he said, the trouble with the early Beethoven sonatas, you can't hide behind great feelings, great concepts, convincing presentation. You got to really play. I mean, it's devilishly virtuosic. But in the concertos, I would say the virtuosity is more visible because it's intended partially as display and partially as display of himself. The concertos, for that reason, are more comfortable for me. I mean, they're hardly comfortable pieces, but in the sonatas, there's much more of that cussed Beethoven quality of he doesn't care how you're going to do it. He wants to hear that music. Whereas in the piano concertos, yes, of course, that spot we talked about in The Emperor is very awkward. And there's plenty of really difficult music in it, but I don't think nothing presses me as much as the virtuosity of Appassionato Waldstein, or let's not even talk about Hammerklavier. I mean, that's a sort of different universe. Plus, you're doing it all yourself. But it's definitely the same guy. It's the same hand. It's the same awkwardness. It's the same stubborn insistence on what he wants and the boisterous good nature. So I would say the writing feels more similar to me than different.
Sometimes the piano writing is quite similar to the concerti. I mean, Les Adieux and The Emperor have almost identical passage work in the third movements.
Absolutely, and they're written at almost the same time in his life.
I notice in general the concertos have a lot more, I don't want to call it stock writing, but lots of scales, lots of chords, lots of arpeggios.
Much more than the sonatas, definitely.
Exactly.
And even the fourth concerto, which most of us think is the most wonderful musically, it's got a lot of scales and stuff. I mean, in the fourth concerto, if it sounds too much like scales, you're not doing your job very well, because within those scales is so much music, much more than in the first concerto, say, where that's just show off stuff. Whereas, when you're playing those passages in the fourth concerto, they're all melodically beautiful.
Let's dive into a couple. Let's hear some. We have all your recordings on hand, so we'll play a few snippets.